Alright, so now we're going to look at lesson 5.3. Now some of you may be saying, now wait a minute Mr. B, you just used that picture on the last lesson in 5.2. And I would say, you're right. Because see, 5.2 was talking about going from percents into decimals and fractions. 5.3 is just the opposite. Instead, I'm going to go from fractions and decimals into my percents. Really what this whole lesson about is having all three. If I'm given one, let's say I'm given the percent, I can find my decimal, I can find my fraction. If I'm given my decimal, I can find the other two. Or if I'm given my fraction, I can find the other two. So it's constantly going through the same information we've done for the past two lessons. The key to lesson 5.1 was what? To remember that a percent is comparing something to, alright, so some of you remember, in lesson 5.1 we're talking about percent is equal to a number compared to a denominator of 100. That can be a decimal at the top, that can be a larger number at the top than 100, that can be a regular looking fraction, as long as my denominator is 100. If I'm looking at that every single time, then that makes the other two, the fractions and the decimals, easier to remember. So we're going to be going through some of the very same problems and same steps, but combining them and going in different directions. So my question that I'm going to start with in chapter 5.3 is dealing with basketball. And they're talking about that I have 11/20ths of games for the season for one team, and 524 as a decimal point. So 524 thousandths for the record for the other team. Now, I really don't know anything about basketball. I'm a wrestler. I don't need to know the first thing about basketball. All I need is what these numbers are and that I'm going to be comparing. Well, how am I going to compare them? Well, this whole lesson is about comparing, changing into percentages. So I'm going to change into percentages in order to compare these two numbers. And therefore, the greatest percentage is going to have to be the best season that there was. So let's look at the numbers once again that they give us. We're going to start with just the 11/20ths. Now the 11/20ths takes us back to two different lessons in units, doesn't it? 11/20ths we're dealing with unit 1 where we talked about fractions, and unit 4 where we talked about fractions, ratios, and rates. And it was the same steps then, it's going to be the same steps now. So this tells us in the blue, step by step, what we need to do. It says to multiply the blank and blank by the same value to write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So we know we need a denominator of 100, and it has to be equivalent, so we're asking what? What we multiply the numerator and the denominator by to get 100. I know I need 100 to be my denominator because we're changing them into percentages. So if my 100 is my denominator, then what am I going to multiply this fraction by? By 5s, right? So I'm going to multiply both by 5s, top and bottom. That gives me a denominator of 100, because 20 times 5 is indeed 100. So it gives me a numerator of 11 times 5, which is going to give me 55. So then it says to write the ratio as, well, that's when we get into our new lesson. Now we're going to write it as a percentage. And the percentage, once again, the way I do that is I simply take the numerator, once I have a denominator of 100, and I bring it down and add a percent sign. So as I'm working through that then, if I keep the 55, I know I'm going to end up with 55%. So the percent of games won by the Phoenix Suns is simply 55%. So now I need to know how the Heat did. So when I look at the Heat and I start to look at what we're doing and I see that, well, that kind of confuses me because we saw something like that in the last lesson, but it's not the same, is it? Well, if we think back to the last lesson, it might be a little easier if we actually have it up. So here's the screen that we did where we did the same type of math. We had this decimal point of 25.81%, and we needed to change it back into a decimal. So we divided by 100. And we talked about that if I'm dividing, I'm making smaller. So I moved it to the left. and my zeros on the 100 told me how many times to move it, so I moved it 2 times, which gave me 0.2581. So I know that that was going to be my decimal point when I had an original percentage of 25 and 81/100. So what we're looking at today then is reversing that process. We're going to completely do it backwards because we're going to go from a decimal into a percentage. So when I go into a percentage and I look at what I'm doing, well, we go back and we review in the blue words. It says to write a percent as a decimal, I'm going to divide by, well, that was the dividing by 100. So I moved it to the left 2 times, going from percent into decimal. But now we're going to write a decimal as a percent, so I'm going to do the reverse of that. I'm now going to multiply. And what am I going to multiply by? Well, I'm going to multiply by 100, because I need to move my decimal point 2 places to the right. Why do I move it to the right? Because I'm going to make it into my percent. So my only option is to move it to the right. So when I move it to the right, and I move it 2 zeros 2 times, I move it once, and move it twice, it goes right behind the 2, so I can see that what I end up with is 52.4%. So the Miami Heat's percentage for the season was 52.4. So when I now come down to comparing the two, the Suns had 55%, the Heat had 52.4%, so who had a better season? Well, that would be the Suns, because they had a greater percentage of wins. So when I look at the next examples that they give us, we have a decimal point. It says to write a fraction as a percent. Well, how a fraction? Well, a fraction just has to have a denominator of what? Now, 100. So the first thing I have to do is I have to change my 7/10, which means 7/10, and write it as a fraction. So I'm just going to put my 7/10. But then when I say, well, I need a denominator of 100, then I have to know how I'm going to do that. And to get my 100, then I multiply by the same value in my numerator and my denominator. So I have 10s there, because my 10 times 10 does give me my denominator of 100 that I need, and therefore 7 times 10 is going to give me 70. So I write the ratio of 70 to 100 now as a percent. And how do I do that? Well, once again, I'm going to keep my numerator and bring it down and just add a percent sign. So 70/100 is the same as 70%. Or I could say, well, 7/10 is a decimal, written as a fraction is 7/10, and 7/10 written as a percent is 70%. So back to that first video, or first screen on the video where I said we're going to have 1 and find the other 2. That's exactly what we're doing. Being able to find the other 2 that are given with the 1. So when I stop and I look at it, then I could say, well, I have a question. Couldn't I just say, well, I have 7 or 0.7, and like I did before, I'm just going to multiply by 100 and move it 2 times to the right, because that 100 gives me 2 different zeros, and then I know it's 100 or 70%? Yeah, I could. So which way is the right way to do it? It really doesn't matter. That's just my kids coming in. Ignore them. Yeah. So I don't care which way you do it. If you want to do it this way and find your 70%, or if you want to start with your decimal 7/10 and move your decimal space 2 times to get your 70%, because they're both the same answer. So either way is actually correct. On B then, ignore that. On B, it gives me the fraction of 3/40 as a decimal and as a percent. And then notice they set this whole long division thing up. Well, why is that? Well, ask yourself, what can I do to 40 to get a denominator of 100? Absolutely nothing, can I? So I have to figure out how I can do that. Well, we know that any fraction is indeed a division problem. So I would put my 3 inside my box, because it's the top number. I always divide by my denominator, so it's my divisor on the outside. I add my decimal, and then I begin to divide. So I'd have to bring my 0 up, and 40 goes into 30 0 times, and 40 goes into 300, well, it'll be 7 times, because it'll be the 280. That gives me 20 left over. I bring down another 0, and 40 goes into 20 5 times. So I can see that that's going to be the same thing as 75 hundredths. So when I work through it, and I get my 75 hundredths, then I have to go down to my next step. So in 75 hundredths, what is my percent? It says to write a decimal as a percent, blank by 100. So once again, we're multiplying by 100. We move the decimal point to the right because we're multiplying 2 different spaces, because the 100 has 2 zeros to it. So I know I'm going to move it twice. So when I have my 75,000, I move it 2 times to the right since I'm multiplying, then that's going to give me a percentage of 7.5 or 7 5/10%. 7.5%. It's the same as 0.075 or 75 thousandths. I end up with both answers, starting with, the original fraction of 3/40. So as I go through these practice problems, please make sure you're staying with me. And if I go too fast, then just pause the video and get your information written down and then restart it. Okay? It's important that you understand these because we're going to be using these for the rest of the year, and you're going to be using these for many years to come. So I start with the idea of 3/25. Well, in 3/25, it shows me that I'm going to multiply by something and get my denominator of 100. Well, what is it asking me? It says to write the fraction or decimal as a percent. So I'm given a fraction, it's going to be a percent. A fraction will be a percent. Decimal 2%, decimal 2%. Okay, so I have 2 of them that I'm going to change. So I multiply 25 by 4. If I multiply the denominator by 4, then I have to multiply the numerator by 4. So then 3 times 4 gives me my 12, and therefore I know that I keep my numerator and add a percent sign. So I end up with 12%. So we're saying that 3/25 is the same as 12%. So then I look at my next one. I have 3/10. Well, 10 is not a denominator of 100, but can I get a denominator of 100? Yeah, I can. So when I write 3/10, I jumped ahead of myself. The other way that we could do this math problem is I could look at it as a division. So some of you are going to prefer to have an equivalent fraction or equivalent ratio. Some of you are going to prefer to divide. Once again, I don't care which way you do it. So if I take my 3, my numerator, and I divide by 25, I add my decimal point, and then I'm going to bring out my decimal, and I'm going to add zeros until I don't have a remainder. So as I'm dividing then, and I have my zeros, 25 goes into 31 times, because 1 times 25 is 25, a remainder of 5, bring down a 0, and 25 does go into 52 times. So I prove that by division, I still get my 12%. Once again, I don't care which way you do it, as long as you get the same answer. Because when I have 12% and I move my decimal to the right 2 different times, multiplying by 100, changing my decimal into a percent, I still get my 12% that I had before. Either way is correct. You choose the way that works best for you. I will almost always show the 2 different ways because some of you are going to prefer equivalent fractions and ratios. Some of you are going to prefer simply to divide and get the decimal. Either way will work. Now on to 3/10. So when I look at that, I know I can change it into a denominator of 100. But what would I multiply the 10 by to get 100? I'd multiply by 10s, wouldn't I? So when I multiply numerator and denominator both by 10, that's going to give me 30/100ths. And to go from a fraction into a percent, I keep the numerator and I simply add my percent sign. So I end up with 30%. When I divide those out, Same process as the one before. My numerator goes on the inside. My denominator goes on the outside. I raise up my decimal because I know it has to be a decimal answer. So 3.0 divided by 10. Well, when I raise my decimal and I start dividing, I just get 0.3. Well, in 0.3 then, I have a decimal, and I need to change it into what? A percentage. So multiplying by 100, or simply move my decimal to the right 2 times and add my percent sign. That works also. When I have my 0.3 and I move it twice, well, I don't have anything there, do I? So what do I add? My 0. And once I have my 0, I know that that's the same thing as 30%, and that process does indeed work each and every time. So now I'm going from a decimal into a percent. Those are the easiest ones, seriously, because if I know the shortcut each and every time, and it's simply to move the decimal to the right 2 times, if I show that, guess what that's called? Showing work. And if I show work, I get that point. So when I move it 2 times, then I add my percent sign, I know that I have 71 7/10%. I showed my work, I have the correct answer, and I have my label, I get all 3 points that I'm going to be awarded. The last one then gives me 0.02, same steps. Move that decimal 2 times to the right, add my percent sign, I know I'm going to get 2%. Now the next set and the final set gets a little bit more difficult. So once again, if I go too fast for you, please stop the video, rewind it a little bit, make sure you stay up with me and you do all your notes. That way you have something to look back on. And if you come back to me for help, I'm going to make sure you truly watched the video and took your notes. So please stay with me and fill out your book. So when I look at the directions, and some of you still are skipping directions, it's important to notice what I'm being asked. I'm given here a decimal, here I'm given a fraction, here I'm given a fraction, and here I'm given a decimal, and it asks me to do what? Change into percents like before? Not what it asks. It asks me to do the 2 other forms. So I'm going to have a lot more work, and I'm going to have a lot more answers on here than before. Therefore, I'm also going to earn some extra points. So I'm going to start with my 1/10, my decimal, my fraction. Well, what if I forget what all I'm looking for? I would strongly suggest when I have problems like this where I'm required to have 2 or more answers is to write down what else I'm looking for. So if I have a decimal, I'm going to switch to a fraction and a percent. And if I have a fraction, I'm going to switch to a decimal and a percent. A fraction, decimal, and percent. A decimal, fraction, and percent. I would write that underneath my lines so that I know on my answer line, I have everything that is being asked of me. Because if I only end up with one answer, and I only show work doing one problem, I'm only going to get half the credit that this is worth. So when I start this one out, I'm going to then change from a decimal to a fraction, and I'm going to change from a decimal into a percent. So I've showing my work down here. So how do I do the decimal to a percent? Well, once again, that's the easiest one. I move my decimal how many times? Move it twice, right? In what direction? To the right, add my percent sign. So I move it once, twice, add my percent sign. So when my decimal is back there, and there's a 0 up there in front, I know I'm just going to drop it off. Well, what did I do here? Well, to go from a decimal into this is said 1/100ths. I just write a 1 over my hundredths because it's saying what I'm looking for. And when I have my fraction and it's over 100, oh yeah, all I have to do is keep my numerator and add a percent sign. So each of those steps is going to give me to the right answer. So I'm just going to bring that down. I'm going to add a 1 as my numerator. And then I'm going to have my 1%. So when I talk about what I'm finding, I have 1%, and I have my 1/100th as my fraction. When I go to 13/40ths, what do I do to my 40 to get 100? I can't do anything, can I? It's what we said before in the previous set. Well, I'm going to be changing them into decimals, and I'm going to be changing them into percentages. So that means I'm going to have to do some division on this one. So when I have my 13, my numerator, divided by my denominator, and therefore I'm going to end up with a decimal, then I can switch my decimal into a percent. So when I divide, then I'm going to take 40. It won't go into 1. It won't go into 13, but it will go into 130. How many times? Well, it'll go in 3 times, because 3 times 40 is my 120. And when I subtract, I get 10, and I bring down a 0. Well, 40 goes into 100 2 times, because 2 times 40 is 80, and that gives me a remainder of 20. And then, have to bring down a 0. I can't have any remainders on these. I have to keep dividing until I don't have any remainder left. And 40 goes into 200 5 times. So I know my decimal is 0.325. And then once I know that my decimal is 0.325, 325 thousandths, then I go down, and to make it into a percent, once again the easy way, moving it 2 times to the right, adding my percent sign. So I end up with 32 5/10% and a decimal of 0.325 or 325 thousandths. So then on my next one, I have 6/5. And what do I notice about 6/5? It's an improper fraction, isn't it? So I know I'm going to have a 1 in there somewhere when I do my information. But when I start doing 6/5, I'm still going to go to a decimal, and I'm going to go to a percent. So 6/5, if I divide, then I end up with my 6, my numerator, divided by my 5. And then when I get my decimal, then it's easy to change into my percent. So my 6.0 divided by 5, the work would be 5 going into 6 one time, which is 5, and 1 left over. Now I notice I didn't bring up my decimal point, did I? So I need to bring that up so I don't forget where it goes. Because on some of our answers, we're forgetting our decimals, which completely changes the value that we're talking about. So then I bring down my 0. 5 goes into 10 how many times? 2 times. So I know my decimal is 1 2/10, because once I do that multiplication, I don't have a remainder anymore. But once I have the decimal, then is the easy part. I have 1.2 or 1 2/10, changing that into a percentage, moving it to the right. How many times? 2 times. Once again, I don't have a digit there, so I fill in with a 0. I move it twice. So now I know that my decimal is 1.2 and my percent is 120%. My last one then. It gets a little tricky. There's going to be more steps in solving this one. This one is said 8 thousandths. I need a fraction and I need a percentage. So when I look at my percentage, it's the easiest one to start with. I move my decimal to the right 2 times, and I add my percent sign. So when I move it twice, I end up with 0.8%. That one's pretty easy. What about this weird 0.8 over 100? I don't understand what I'm doing here. So when I look at that, I have 0.8 because I moved this 2 times. I end up with 0.8, and I put it over the 100. But when I say that, how do I actually say that number? Because some of you will see that right away. It'll be an easier step for you. I'll come back to it here in just a second, but this is actually said 8 thousandths. So I'm going to write 8 thousandths up here. And as I said, I'll come back to that in just a second. But as I work through it, I say, well, I have to have a whole number at the top in order to do my fractions. So I'm going to multiply by 10 and multiply by 10. And what does that give me? That's where my 8 thousandths is used. So moving that decimal 2 times and knowing that it's 0.8 out of 100 because it's my percent, it works, but I still have to change it into what it actually is called. This is where your decimal spaces and learning your decimal spaces is going to be so important from this point forward, because it really does make those type of problems easier. But once I have my 8 1,000ths, what do I do with it? I'm going to have to reduce, aren't I? I wonder what I reduce by. I'll give you a hint. 8 will go into both of them. So when I reduce by 8 then, I have 8 1,000ths reduced by 8, and I get 1 over 125. So my answers for number 8 would be 8/10 of a percent, or 0.8%, and 1 over 125 for my fraction. So there's a lot of steps there, and there's 2 answers for each one, and 2 things to show work on. So these are now worth 4 total points. And then when I have a label, and a label, and a label, and a label, well, that actually makes each of these problems worth 5 points. So 5, 10, 15, 20. Those 4 problems is worth 20 points. And when you have that section on your homework, if there's 4 of them, they're still going to be worth 20 points. And it is so important that you show all of your work, you show your steps, you get the right answer, and you keep the labels that you need for your percentages, so you can get all the credit that you deserve to get on your assignment. So our final step then is just remembering what we're talking about. I kind of changed my arrows on this last screen because we're really going in all different directions. No matter what I start with, I can get the other 2. I can start with my fraction and get my decimal and my percent and get my decimal and my fraction, or my decimal and get my fraction and percent. It doesn't matter what I'm starting with. I know the math to do each and every one. It does get a little hectic remembering all the different steps. So I would advise, if you struggle with it, to go back and re-watch the section of the video that you're not sure about. Maybe it's going from that weird decimal into a fraction, or that weird decimal into a percent. Re-watch the video so that you understand what we're doing. But it's truly important that you understand, because we're going to continue to build on this information from this point forward for all of Chapter 5 and all the next lessons that we do until the end of the school year. But this is also stuff you're going to do in 7th grade. So look at the board for your homework assignment, and as you're working, if you have any questions for me, please come and ask.